Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab, sponsored by CPA Practice Advisor, with your hosts, Randy Johnston and Brian Tankersley.
Welcome to the Accounting Technology Lab. I'm Randy Johnston with my co-host Brian Tankersley. We've got a fun topic for you today. We're going to take a look back, and we don't often wax poetic nowadays, but it is Microsoft's 50th anniversary. That was actually officially on Friday, April 4th of 2025 was the 50th anniversary. And we thought it would be informative, frankly, to just take a moment and look back at what's happened with Microsoft. So, as you think about the company, obviously many of you use them for your productivity suite with Microsoft Office, and you have your operating system of Windows. And even if you're a Mac user, you're probably using Microsoft Office as well, besides many of the other tools that they have. But, it has been a very interesting ride. Microsoft's only had 3 CEOs this entire time, and they were together on that Friday the 4th. But as we start thinking about, the way this has evolved from a, very humble tool development company, if you would, it is fascinating to, reflect on this. Now, Paul Allen, Bill Gates, obviously Paul has passed away, and many of the founding fathers of computing are passing away at this point or have retired out. But the vision of what could be done is pretty stunning in my mind. So, I think that said, I'm going to go to the way, way back machine with you for just a minute, and we're going to bring Brian with me. So, we're going back in time. Yeah. And it turns out that we're entering the twilight zone for just a minute because, it turns out I used the very first copies of DOS. I used some of the very earliest copies of Microsoft Basic. My first textbook that I wrote was Basic using Micros. So again, I was around the language stuff from the early on. And of course, I was a language computer science specialist of the day. So all of the big things like Basic and, headline news lately with COBOL, with the Social Security Administration, and Lisp because of AI, having wrote my first AI programs in Lisp 50 years ago. Again, I was an old hardcore programmer and I could write in any language of the day. So I hung with a lot of these techie people as they were developing this stuff and had the good privilege of getting the first IBM PC in Kansas, which ran DOS and Peachtree and BPM accounting software at the time. It was really a fun thing to do. Well, it turns out
No, BPM accounting software. That's the group out of Pensacola that was CPAS, that was Mark Fenimore and everything.
No, you might have misheard me, Brian. That was VPM, which was in Linux, but
Yeah.
BPM was out of Texas. And there were a number of companies out of Texas that ran some beautiful stuff, as it turns out, for accounting software, but many of those didn't actually, stay the course for a long time. Well, when you look back to the 1981 release of the IBM PC, DOS was king, and it took a while for us to get to Windows 2.0 and 3.0, and actually Windows 1.0. And so it turns out Windows 1.0 release, was still back in the dark ages in the 80s. And it turns out that they were competing heavily against Apple with Lisa and other pieces at that point. But Windows 1.0 was really not that big of a deal as much as it was for the IBM PS2s, which were also announced in April 2nd, 1987. And at that time, IBM was suggesting you could run OS/2, which you could, and the designs of the IBM PCs in those days, the Model 50, 60, and 80, were brilliant bloody boxes, as it turns out. Well, this microchannel architecture started to get people thinking that it would be a very interesting time to build much more sophisticated boxes. But let's get the the year right for you. Windows 1 came out in 1985. And I was teaching Windows and the graphical user interface in that time frame as we evolved from Windows 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0. And frankly, it wasn't until Windows 3.1 in 1992 and Windows for Workgroups in 1993 that it really became a doable deal. So, Brian has been scrolling a few things for you, but I would like to just maybe stop for a moment on the very crude looking Windows interface in Windows 1.0. Okay. Now that Windows 1.0, it was clear, it was character. And I was teaching this to students at great volumes and explaining the future will be this graphical user interface, even though it looks pretty ugly right now. I can see the benefits. So I'm happy to teach you DOS and automate a lot of things, but the fact of the matter is you better start getting used to this whole Windows world. Well, the Windows 3.0 interface, all of a sudden things changed in a big way. It was clear that the graphics quality of the Mac had made it across, and of course, Apple and Jobs and Microsoft and Gates were, kind of bitter enemies at that point in time. But it was also real plain that this environment was going to evolve relatively quickly. So with Windows 3.0 release in 1990, we could see the future was coming. Many of you were attending our courses at that point in time, and we were showing Windows 3.0 and then 3.1, which was getting close, and Windows for Workgroups really made the difference. But at this point, Brian, I think maybe if we think about Windows 95 together, there's a bunch of tipping point dates that started happening in the 80s in the Microsoft world. So now I'm going to spin us back. We're going to hold Windows for just a minute here at 95 because that's a big deal. And we're going to go back to 1983. And in the 1983 time frame was when we got Microsoft Word. Now, at that point, most of you were, if you were in computing at that time, you were using WordStar, you were using, an early version of WordPerfect. And most of the competitive word processors were wildly better than Microsoft Word. There's still there's still many features of Microsoft Word that are not as good as these, other competitors. I'm actually going to pick on Multimate for just a minute because it was a particularly powerful word processor that was used in legal, and WordPerfect eventually became a major competitor there. But there are
I remember financial statements being typed in WordPerfect in the early 90s, and then I remember Coopers and Lybrand at the time we then had to learn this tool called AmiPro that was Lotus's word processor at the time when we had on Windows 3.1. So it's you're going back to the very beginning of my career.
Understood. And in fact, as you were saying that, I was thinking about all the other competitors that you had to learn that were word processors. The Smart word processing out of Kansas City, the Smart system was a beautiful deal. WordStar, I can still do all the WordStar commands, as useless as that capability is. But this concept of having a word processor that could be graphical was a pretty big breakthrough because there was character versions of most of these word processors as they tried to break over into this object-oriented processing that we're used to today. Well, that was a pretty big breakthrough as it turns out. But the next big breakthrough, of course, was this Windows release in 1985. And there was a convergence of major sorts in 1995 when Windows 95 was released. and Internet Explorer was released. Now, I won't give you all the backstory today on Microsoft Office. I had the good pleasure of doing consulting work at Microsoft in that window as we evolved into the Word and Excel and PowerPoint suite, calling this thing Office. Okay. And I can give you a very interesting backstory sometime when we're at a conference, including the way that we actually priced the system. I can actually picture while I'm telling you today, sitting in my office, and it was at Fifth and Main here in Hutchinson where I live. And I put my feet up on the desk, which I don't do very often, and I said, "Tell you what we're going to do." And that's exactly what Microsoft executed to try to win market share from Lotus 123 and from WordPerfect. And but the whole internet thing also was breaking through. Now, I was fortunate enough to start on internet connections early in the 70s. And it became obvious that the internet was going to be a big deal. And Microsoft, of course, released Internet Explorer. So now we've got that, and we've got Windows 95, and we've got Office 95. And our K2 organization had the pleasure of presenting for Microsoft in Australia and New Zealand as kind of evangelists of the platforms in those windows. So you can hear a little bit of fondness in this, but another major breakthrough that happened at the same time was Microsoft Network was also launched. Now, the Microsoft Network was part of our design. It was the fundamental beginnings of what has become Microsoft 365 or Office 365. And it was a competitor to AOL. But what we wanted to do was make internet access a lot more easy, and Microsoft could get to the pops all over the world and get you that nice connection. Brian, I can't do the modem sound, or I would for you. And we could have, probably had that modem sound around for this, but you basically most of the time dialed in, and Microsoft Network gave you the access without local charges, which was a big deal. What was your choice? AOL, CompuServe, and so forth. But this,
Yeah, and my family actually did Prodigy for a while, which was affiliated with, I think, H&R Block maybe, but it ended up also, there was also one called Genie that was run by GE. So it was a very big deal. I actually back in the day ran a bulletin board system back in the mid 80s, which was back when I guess I was about a junior in high school when I did that. And it was, you had a dedicated phone line to it because getting on the internet was not something that you did. There were no ISPs that were anything other than dial-up, other than the phone company. I mean, it was just a very different world. I thank God every day that we didn't have camera phones and social media back when I was a teenager, so that the stupid things that I did as a teenager would not live on in perpetuity the way it does for the kids today.
completely understood. And thinking about all this modem, and that's not the purpose of today's call. I'm just thinking that when I got the first DSL, actually ISDN. Sorry, let's tell the story right.
Yeah.
Got the first ISDN in the state of Kansas, and then moved on and got the first DSL and got the first cable line and got the first satellite and got I've always tried to have the first of the mostest, just so we had the experience. But that's a story for another day also. So again, at a conference, you pull me up and just say, turn on the old history machine, and I'll turn on the Wayback Machine. But we're at 95. So we've got this convergence of Microsoft Network and Windows 95 and Internet Explorer and Office 95. And all of a sudden, you've got this kind of all-inclusive environment. You can throw a little accounting software at it, and a few other things. You can make a real deal. So we began.
And pivot tables came in around then, by the way. So pivot tables really are that old.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, we were doing the design work on pivot tables in 95 is when we started that design work, and they were released in Service Pack 2 of Office 97. And, so they've evolved for, 30 years in effect that way. But, now rolling it forward, we had Windows 95, and a lot of you used Windows 95 for a long time. But then after Windows 95, the Windows 98. So, Brian, if you can flip over to the Windows 95 view, uh, what you'll find is, it just kind of reminds you, that was pretty ugly. But you know what? At the time, extraordinary availability and access. And you'll notice MSN is up there, set up the Microsoft network. So, that's kind of the way it worked. Then Microsoft kind of had a oopsie. I won't go into all the oopsies, but Windows 98 was a marginal upgrade. And, many of the other versions in here, Windows Vista and so forth, they were kind of lost their way. But they found their way again with Windows 2000, which was really a special variant of the Windows Server operating system. And so they brought server reliability into the desktop with Windows 2000. Now, remember that when a Windows version was released, like 95, there was often a release of Office, like 98 or 2000 or 2003. And of course, we switched from naming of years to letters for a while. But, the Windows 2000 interface became pretty standard for a long time, still in use today. But the next successor behind that was Windows XP, which, was kind of the 2001 time frame. So now you can tell we're moving right along here. But there was another significant release in 2001. So, Brian, if you flip back over, a major release in 2001 was the Xbox. So we had the privilege of working at Microsoft to help build the Xbox. And of course, I was very interested in the superb graphic processing capability and the ability to run Linux on the console and so forth. And of course, Microsoft was trying to offset the PlayStations and the I want to say Game Boys.
Now, the Xbox V1 was like a P3, Pentium 3, um, 700 megahertz, something like that. And you had like 64K of RAM, or was it 64 megs of RAM? It was not 64 megs of RAM, and hard drives back then were denominated in single digit gigs, right?
Yeah, they were still pretty much like that, but the main thing was that it was a RISC power box. And so, I was very much watching what was happening over at Sun with the Spark workstations and, very much into high-end CAD and all those things. But I wanted a computer that could maybe control the whole home, and the Xbox had a chance of doing that. Eventually, Microsoft came up with a Windows Home Edition PC. But as we went from XP into now the failed Vista, if you would, that really got us to the Windows 7 release, which was 2009. And in that same time frame, we also got to see another major release from Microsoft, because with Windows 7 came the search engine of Bing. Now, Bing, there's rumors came from Groundhog Day, Bing, right? But as it turns out, that may not be true, but it wasn't a very good search engine early on. It's a pretty good search engine today.
So again, to get back to accounting here for a minute, I remember in the 2000 timeframe when the Windows versions of softwares were starting to come out, and I distinctly remember Larry Lacerte saying that there would always be a DOS version of the Lacerte tax software, and so we've come a very, very long way.
We have, in fact, I remember helping a lot of these developers convert from DOS to Windows, and many of them saying people won't really use Windows; they'll only use DOS. And it's like, yeah, I don't think you're right on that. But
And Peachtree really was crushing QuickBooks until Windows came out. QuickBooks for the DOS, the old versions of QuickBooks were not adopted well, and the Peachtree for DOS was that and Great Plains were the two tools that the accountants used at the time. You really didn't see QuickBooks very much at all.
yeah, that is absolutely right. So When you think about these evolutions, at various points in time, you realize there was a major breakthrough. And speaking of major breakthroughs that we should have put in the right time frame, my omission, Brian, was this is Microsoft Excel's 40th birthday. Another reason why this nostalgic look back is important, because that was released on September 30th of 1985. So when I was talking about Word being released in 83, Excel in 85, those are all kind of big deals. But see, we're now talking about search engines with Bing, and now we get a new generation of browser in the 2015 window.
And I remember, going back to that, I remember my CFO at the time in like 1995 having me switch from Lotus to Excel because of pivot tables sometime in that time frame. And I distinctly remember it because he was a former Anderson guy, and it was heresy to use something besides Lotus 123 at that time.
Yeah, it really was. So, reverting back, and again, my timeline for you is not perfect, but I'm really trying to help you just get a flavor. See, Windows 8 was a major breakthrough, but Microsoft had already kind of missed the mobile thing with Apple and the iPhone. And when Windows 8 came out on August 1st of 2012, that was a pretty significant breakthrough in the operating system game again. But the next major breakthrough came with the Windows 10 release. And, that was really where many of us are at today, with the one caveat and the key piece of learning for today. Windows 10 was released on July 29th of 2015. Its end of life is October 14th of 2025, a 10-year window. And there are going to be 3 years of extended service that you can put on Windows 10. And a lot of you are going to hold on to it because you don't have the hardware to run Windows 11. And you're most likely going to have to buy new hardware to replace it. And we'll see how hardware pricing and availability continues. But this then evolution from Windows 10 to Windows 11 was the next major change in terms of operating systems. And it was really about Office 2010, Office 2013, that the whole Office 365 and Microsoft 365 initiatives happened. We see Office 2016 and Office 2019, but it was clear that Microsoft wanted and needed the recurring revenue. So when Windows 11 was released on October 5th of 2021, at that point, they were really trying to drive a dominant Office 365, Microsoft 365 purchase strategy. Now, we figured the future of Microsoft will be some sort of a Windows operating system. It might be called Windows 12. It might be called something else. It is clear that this year we're talking about Copilot Plus, the AI-powered PCs, and a lot of that type of traffic. But even though we've seen more SaaS-based products and more cloud adoption, it has also become clear to us that the co-processing that's done by the PCs and the phones at the edge for AI is a pretty big deal. So while many say, just don't worry about it, just use, thin clients and dumb PCs and Chrome-based PCs and just access everything in the cloud. You can do that, but you're going to give up some of your AI capabilities, because AI can be run centralized on a SaaS, Azure, AWS type of environment. In fact, I am now showing the 4 major companies providing AI-based cloud computing in our tech update presentation. And Azure, by the way, is not one of them, just for the record. And when you get to this cooperative processing, next Working on desktops and laptops is your next AI place, and working on your smartphones is the third place. And you're going to see that I think this will continue more and more as we get further and further out to the edge. I do have a bit of a concern that, internet speeds will stay up with the consumption that we need, but very smart people are in that. So, Brian, I know we missed a lot of things in this window just chit-chatting about this. And I know I didn't let you talk much, but, bottom line here, we've evolved with Microsoft from a tool development company, programming languages, if you will, to operating systems with DOS and many versions of Windows and many versions of Office and innovations in internet access to really provide a standard platform for developers to work on. And what you may not be able to appreciate is almost every tool that you have in use today on your Mac, your Linux boxes, or your PCs is possible because of Microsoft tool sets. At heart, Microsoft is a developer's company that now just happens to have a lot of revenue from productivity tools like Windows and Office and Azure, SQL, things like that. And again, lots of other products in their line and lots of acquisitions that made it possible. So, Brian, closing thoughts or parting thoughts for our listeners and viewers today?
Gosh, well, we are such a long way from the first computer I ever had, which was an Apple II Plus, that had, I think, a scalding 64K of RAM and a didn't have a hard drive, but it had two floppy drives that held 143K each per disk, and so it was it's an interesting time. As we look at all this stuff, remember what many of you may not remember. As we sit here with people talking about AI replacing accounting right now, I think it's important for everybody to remember that that we've had so many things that were going to replace accounting over the years. Computers were going to replace accounting when I was in college in the late 80s, early 90s. Then I was going to lose my job to a PC. Then I was going to lose my job to, what's the next thing? ERP. Then I was going to lose my job to the cloud, and then it was outsourcing, and the only thing I can think of that's really a constant over my 33 years in the accounting profession now is that there's always something that somebody says is going to end accounting. Okay. And it hasn't ended yet. And I don't see it happening anytime soon, because as soon as we take the humans out of it, it's, the fraud's going to tick up, and then you're going to have to throw the humans back in to get rid of it. So it's a fabulous time to be in the profession. And Microsoft has been with us a long time. And even though many of you are switching over to cloud hosting and things like that, I want you to notice that the cloud applications have not quite caught up with the desktop applications. And here's what I mean. You can do, certainly there are options for cloud-based tax software, and primarily tax software is the one I'm thinking about. Payroll's largely gone to the cloud, but for tax, the only really cloud-hosted things you still have are, you have the option of doing Intuit's ProLine, ProConnect Tax Online, and then you have CCH as Access, which does require an installed client, and then you have Thomson's Go system, but that's it. And so it's a very, very long way. I remember my CD server that I had to maintain to have all the CDs from all the research providers, and how I had to swap the discs out and everything else. And so it's been an interesting ride, to be sure. Very excited to be where we are today, and I can't wait to see what comes in the future.
Well, I appreciate that. Now you even gave me more old home week nostalgia. My earliest machine, not the first, but one of my early machines was a Morrow Micro Decision, CPM based machine that we were so lucky to have WordStar on. That's how I wrote my first books. I still have my Morrow Microdecision machine, and it still works, which is pretty fascinating. I think I can still run it.
Well,
But
I remember when I was at UC Davis. I went to UC Davis in the fall of '87, and I had a friend that was at another university, and so I went through and got set up so that I could send email to him. And it was internet email, and it was like early days. I had to fill out a form to get an email account, and it was a big deal at the time. So it's amazing how much things have changed in the years.
it is. Well, I hope you enjoyed our little bit of walk back and look back at Microsoft. Other companies probably deserve similar overview and accolades, but there's not a lot of technology companies that are 50 years old, and I'm betting you're using many of Microsoft's tools. We will speak to you very soon again, and we appreciate you listening in when we talk to you again on another Accounting Technology Lab. All the best to you. Good day.
Thank you for sharing your time with us. We'll be back next Saturday with a new episode of the Technology Lab from CPA Practice Advisor. Have a great week.